Okay, thank you for joining me again after several weeks break. Not a happy period now, of course, and I think we should start by saying that our learning, please God, should be to the schus of those who have become injured or displaced as a result of the current fighting, and also for the schus of the safe return of all the captives in Gaza. And we hope that everybody will have the strength to make their way through this difficult period, and we will be able to go from darkness to light. It's not a short story, but if it's a story that eventually works out to the benefit of everyone, to the society in Eretz Israel, maybe it'll knock some sense in to those people who've been arguing over trivia or over politics, then at least some good will have come out of it. So, in Yetz Hashem, there should be for the schus of a successful outcome. We're still in the Sechet Yoma. We're on Daf Tet Omid Base 9b, which is in the first parak, and we've essentially been in quite a large block of Agadah, of non-halachic Gemara, which has been interesting, and because it's actually quite fundamental to some of the ideas that are spoken about the state of the Jewish people, and applies today as much as in the times of the first and second Beit HaMikdash. The parak started with the description of a Kohen Gadol and his function on Yom Kippur, and how he was prepared for 7 days prior to the Yom Kippur service. He was isolated, kept away from anything that would make him tomei, and at the same time he was educated in the processes that he'd have to undertake in the long and arduous service of the Yom Kippur Avodah, which he did all by himself without any Kohanic assistance. And the Gemara told us how it was necessary to pump the Kohanim with the correct procedures, because some of the Kohanim Gedolim in the past had not been true to Jewish tradition, and they bought their way in. They corruptly purchased their way in into the highest position. They were tzedukim, and they were not necessarily informed on how the service should be done according to proper halachic standards. So the teachers of the Kohanim would tell them exactly what they had to do. So it was a sad reflection on the state of the Kahuna Gedola during Beit Sheni, when unfortunately there was corruption at the highest levels. And the Pharisees, the Chachamim, were allied more with the poorer people and with the non-Kohanim. So there was a very difficult existence or coexistence with the Kohanim Gedolim. But at the same time, there was a Beis HaMikdash. The Avodah, the service, and the Beis HaMikdash needed to continue. But there was a certain suspicion of the Kohanim. And in the topic of the conduct of Kohanim Gedolim, the Gemara went on to say that during the first Beis HaMikdash, there were only a very small number of Kohanim Gedolim, because they lasted their period and they were pious people. Whereas in the period of the second Beis HaMikdash, which was very, very similar, there were hundreds of Kohanim Gedolim. And it seemed that most of them only survived a year, if a year. Many of them would have been killed or died in the service. Others were replaced because somebody else paid the authorities more money for the privilege of being Kohen Gadol. So that was the sad state of affairs. And in discussing that, the Gemara went on to talk about the contrast between the first Beis HaMikdash and the second Beis HaMikdash, and why it was so much better during Bais Rishon, which brought the Gemara to talk about the causes of the destruction of the two Botei Mikdash. I mean, if there was such piety, I won't take that. If there was such piety during the times of the first Beis HaMikdash, why was the Beis HaMikdash destroyed? What was the cause of the destruction of Bais Rishon and of Bais Sheni? So the Gemara said that, and this is well known, that during Bais Rishon, the three cardinal sins were transgressed. That is idol worship, murder, and adultery. And because of that, the Bais Rishon had to be destroyed. But during Beit Sheni, the sin there was not so much for those cardinal sins, but simply because of sinat chinam, and we discussed that for some while. The fact that people couldn't get on with each other, that they gave each other's away to the authorities, that they behaved as if they were on good terms, but behind the scenes and in their heart, they harbored hatred and sought ways of getting even. And this also applied to the highest classes of Jewish society, and even the Talmidei Chachamim were, in fact, not blameless, as the Netziv says in one of his famous introductions, that they were Lomdei Torah, but at the same time, each suspected the other one of not being as frum as he was. Sounds very much like today. So that was the Avera that brought down the second Beis HaMikdash. In the first Beis HaMikdash, there wasn't Sinat Chinam. People were genuine about how they felt. And if they didn't feel well about you, they told you how they felt. And they asked you to improve yourself. If you didn't, they might have knocked you on the head and murdered you. But the sort of quiet and hidden, concealed nature of Sinas Chinam, where you hate someone in your heart, that was a feature of the second Beis HaMikdash and caused its destruction. That's what the Gemara said. And it takes us to where we're going to start today, which is again going to be a comparison of the Jewish population in Eretz Yisrael at the time of Bais Rishon as compared to those during Bais Sheni. Which set of people, if you were to choose between the two populations, the population that was, if you like, guilty for the destruction of Beis HaMikdash Rishon, and those for the destruction of Beis HaMikdash Sheni, and those who came after them, who were descended from them, which class of people was the higher and which was the lower? Can you really make a comparison between them both? They both were worthy of the Beis HaMikdash being destroyed, but can you make comparisons between them? The Gemara wants to make such a comparison. So I'm going to start with the Gemara on Tet Onid Beis, and it's 3 lines down from where the Gemara becomes very widest, and it's towards the end of the line, and it says Reish Yochanan v'Reish Aleph to Omri, the last 4 or 5 words. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, that's who they are. Reish Aleph is Rabbi Elazar. So that line begins with the word Ba'ami, 3 lines down from where it becomes widest. So the Gemara now says Rabbi Yochanan, excuse me, for Rabbi Elazar to Omri Travaihu. Actually, I did that, but I'm just going to start another few lines further down. No, well, we'll do that again. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar Domi Travayu. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, they both agreed on the following principle. Rishonim, the members of Bais Rishon, those alive at the time, Shenisgale Avonam, whose iniquity was open to all, was revealed to all, Nisgale Kitson. Their end, the end of their period of captivity and golus, was also open and revealed to them. But Acharonim, the second Beis HaMikdash, the latter people who were responsible for the destruction of Bais Sheni because of Sinat Chinam, Shalonis Gala Avonam, whose Averis were not open and revealed. Lonis Gala Kitzom, the end of their time of Golus was also not revealed. Oh, and just another nice mysterious statement in the Gemara, but actually it means simply this, that Bais Rishon, when it was destroyed, the Nevi'im foretold the end of the Golus, and they said at the end of 70 years, the Jewish people will return. So although they were exiled to Bavel, they were able to return gradually, of course, with Ezra and Nehemiah and the other leaders that came back in relatively small numbers, and then rebuilt the temple on a small scale, but they rebuilt the temple. There was only a 70-year period. Moreover, that 70-year period was foretold, which means that the Jews who were exiled to Bovel knew how long their exile would be. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? 70 years, after all, is about 3 generations. Nevertheless, it was foretold that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and there is movement towards a resolution and to rebuilding. So that was a positive thing. And why is it? Why was it revealed to them that it would be 70 years? Because their crime was revealed. Very strange. What does that mean? Their crime was revealed. It means that the transgressions of which they were guilty, which we've discussed, the 3 cardinal sins, was something that was open to everyone. In other words, if you like, their sin was much more public. If your sin is advertised, then the end of your dollars will be advertised. A public sin is not such a bad sin, according to this, because everyone knew who was a wretch and who wasn't a wretch. No one pretended to be kosher v'yosher. There wasn't hypocrisy. Therefore, the end of their tribulation and their golus was foretold to them. However, by Sheni, we say that the sin of sinas chinam is holding hatred in your heart and not making it clear to somebody else. Hypocrisy is something which is not revealed. Because their crime was not revealed, the extent of their punishment and of their exile was never revealed. No prophets ever said that the second Golus would last so many years. In fact, we're still going strong in Golus today, in a sense, because we haven't been told when we will be able to come back, in the sense that we were originally to build another Beis Hamikdash. So from this, it would appear that there is if you're going to make a comparison between sinat chinam and murder, etc., that sinat chinam is worse. And it's worse because you're doing it privately. Anything you do privately, you don't want to show somebody else as a hypocrite. It means that you're, in a sense, more concerned about what God thinks than what men think. Well, if you do something openly, you show you're equally unconcerned. But if you sin privately, it shows that you want the world to think you are, and you don't believe God's watching, that you're holy, but you don't think that God's watching. And that is a level of effrontery to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is worse than actually doing major sins directly. We'll carry on and discuss this, because again, it seems very strange to be able to equate murder, for example, to speaking badly of people or harboring a grudge, which is sinas chinam. How can you nevertheless compare the two? Let's go on and we'll see how the Gemara compares the two, why it's possible to actually say one is worse than the other. So we go on now with Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, and this is another very strange, striking statement. Generally, we find that statements made by the Chachamim in the Gemara are appear to be exaggerated or very hyperbolic in some ways. In other words, you wouldn't express it that way even if you agreed with them. But they were expressed in this extreme way in order to make an impression. And you make more of an impression by striking statements than you do by casually calm statements. And this is what we're going to see now. Rabbi Yochanan says the following: Tova shitzipornon shel rishonim mikreson shel acharonim. See how brief and poetic these statements are. That means a lot, those few words that I've said. Tova, better. Tzipornon were the nails, shel rishonim, the nails, the fingernails of those who came earlier, who were in the Galut of the Beit Rishon, those who survived through the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. Their nails were superior, mikrison shel acharonim, than the stomachs of those who survived the destruction of the second temple. What this means to say, if you compare the two parts of the body over here, the tzipor and the fingernail seems to be an almost trivial part of the body. A person doesn't die because they have a broken fingernail. In fact, we cut our own fingernails. We actually destroy our fingernails. Our fingernails are chad pa'ami. They're disposable. Whereas your stomach is not disposable. Should you lose your stomach, you're not around anymore. It's a major organ. So in order to contrast the two populations, those in Bais Rishon, Bais Sheni, said Rabbi Yochanan, even the fingernails of the first generation of the Bais Rishon were superior in some way, stronger, better, at a higher level than the stomachs, the major organs of those who come later. In other words, there's no comparing the madrega of those in Bais Rishon to Bais Sheni. The Bais Rishon were infinitely greater. That's why he's using this strange expression to that effect. Again, this fortifies what we said before, just strengthens the same statement that the Bais Rishon people, even though their sins were transgressions of the Avodah Zorah, Gilui Rois, and Shvichas Tomim, which seems to be right at the top of the Ten Commandments, nevertheless, we're saying that these guys were better than those who kept the three cardinal sins. That means they did not transgress them, but spoke badly and were hypocrites. Extraordinary statement again. We've seen this a second time now. So, but now we're going to see that there is a machlokes on this, because those of you who are, so to speak, raring to go to attack this statement, after all, let's look at the simple facts. Someone who kills someone is over one of the Ten Commandments. Someone who speaks badly of someone else behind their backs, for example, is not guilty of breaking any of the Ten Commandments. So how can we have the chutzpah to say that someone who is a murderer is a superior and far superior person to someone who has only spoken ill of somebody else? So now Reish Lakish is going to take up that attitude. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who's just said that the Bais Rishon people, despite transgressing the cardinal sins, were better than those in the second temple who only transgressed sinat chinam. So Amele Reish Lakish is always the sparring partner of Rabbi Yochanan. He says to Rabbi Yochanan, how can you say such a thing? Adarabba, on the contrary, acharonim adifi, one has to conclude that those in the second temple who survived, or in the crime of the second temple, those who who survived the second temple are better. Why? Let's see what his argument is. He says, because we're better than they are. He's essentially saying, Reish Lakish is one of those people who survived, if you like, he's a little bit after the destruction of the Second Temple. We are better than the generation who survived and went into Golis and Bovel. Why does Reish Lakish say that about himself and his generation? And he gives the reason. Af al gav de ikar shibud malchius. This is something worth discussing as well. Even though we are suffering under Shibud Malchus, we're under the subjugation of the Romans and the oppressive regime now in Eretz Yisrael, which would be the Roman regime in Eretz Yisrael, Ka'oski Torah. We are seriously engaged in learning Torah. And it's true to say, and this is a fact and we know, the whole of Talmud Bavli, well, not the whole of it, but the Mishnah and the first stage, at least, of the Gemara of Talmud Bavli was written during the period of Bais Sheni, when the exiles were essentially establishing large academies of learning. And there were academies of learning in Eretz Yisrael as well. After Yerushalayim, it moved to Yavne. After Yavne, into the Galil, and Tveria, Caesarea, and all those places that we know. We walk around the Galil. We go from one place to another. Most of these were Talmudic moshavim, which excelled in producing great scholars. So he says, look, here's the evidence on the ground. Eretz Yisrael today and Bovel at the time of Reish Lakish is full of Talmidei Chachamim. And we are survivors of Beit Sheni. Are we not much greater than those who went into Babel? What actually happened during the first Galut in Babel? What do we have as a record of the great academic studies or Torah contributions of those who went into Babel after Nebuchadnezzar? They went up to Babel, they built agricultural communities there. They were there for about 70 years. The story of Esther happens up there. Nothing much is going on in terms of Torah. There is the beginnings maybe of the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, but really it didn't start at all. So therefore he says, look, what are we achieving over here compared to what they're achieved? It seems to suggest that with all our problems, with Sinas Chinam or anything else, we are engaged in learning Torah. And therefore our Mesiras Nefesh under difficult circumstances where we are being governed by a cruel and oppressive regime, that Mesiras Nefesh and learning Torah must raise us above those who lived at the time at Bais Rishon. When they actually went into Bavel, by the way, we know that conditions were actually quite good. Nobody wants to be exiled, but they were allowed to build their own agricultural communities in Bavel. They were not crucified in the same way as they were under the Romans. So under those circumstances, says Reish Lakish, circumstances and the way we deal with them proves that post-Bais Sheni, we're better than post-Bais Rishon. So Amalei, so Rabbi Yochanan answered him, and this is going to be an interesting point in philosophy, this discussion, who is better, Bais Rishon survivors, if you like, or Bais Sheni survivors, or which crime was worse, because one really rolls into the other. So Amalei, says Rabbi Yochanan, a beautiful answer because it doesn't explain. Bira tochiach. Bira means the Beis Hamikdash. The Beis Hamikdash will prove you wrong. It will prove you wrong. Why? She chozra l'rishonim v'lo chozra l'acharonim. Because it returned to the first set of exiles, but it did not return to the second set of exiles. In other words, he says, forget about who's learning and who's not learning. My perspective is different. You want to say that we're all members of elite learning academies. We set that up with Mesiras Nefesh, whereas during the time of return of the Bais Rishon, they did not do that at all. They weren't involved in Torah so much. I say maybe that's true, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof isn't the pudding isn't looking at what people are doing. It's looking at the results of making the pudding. What was the result in Bais Rishon? The result in Bais Rishon, even though when they went to Bavel, maybe they weren't involved in Torah learning, but within 70 years, Hashem had created for them a second Beis HaMikdash, which seems to suggest that the virtues, the sechuyot of the first lot who suffered exile of the first Beis HaMikdash, those sechuyot were greater because it enabled them to be zocha to Bais Sheni. Whereas we, with all our Torah learning, we're still working and we're still waiting for a Beis HaMikdash to be rebuilt, and it hasn't happened. Presumably because whatever sin we have to expiate hasn't been expiated. It seems that in 70 years, the Bais Rishon returnees were able to come back. They expiated the guilt that brought down Bais Rishon. So far in 2,000 years, we haven't expiated the guilt that brought down Bais Sheni. So who's better? Proof of the puddings and the eating. Why haven't we expiated it? Because we're still guilty of those same crimes today. We're not better. We're worse today, says Rabbi Yochanan to Reish Lakish. It's interesting though, when it sounds worse now, but at the time of Reish Lakish would have lived about about 250 or something in the Common Era. So actually, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed about 180 years earlier. So when Rabbi Yochanan was speaking to Reish Lakish, they'd only had about 170 years of exile. Yes, and he was saying, but that's much more than the 70 years that the first Beis HaMikdash exilees had to have. So we must be worse than them because in 170 years it hasn't been rebuilt. If he could say that, so today after 2,000 years, it seems much, much more true than the statement as Rabbi Yochanan made it nearly 2,000 years ago. So we have I would say it's a difference of perspectives. The perspective of Reish Lakish was, we should look at what we're doing. We are being Moser Nefesh. We're being Moser Nefesh more than they were. And therefore, in a sense, we're a greater generation than the exilees of the first Beis HaMikdash. They weren't able to do it, and we, under the same difficult circumstances and more difficult circumstances, are able to establish academies of learning. So says Rabbi Yochanan, says, ultimately you don't look to see whether we're Moser Nefesh or not. Maybe our Mesiras Nefesh is not worthwhile. Maybe it's hypocritical. Maybe it doesn't compensate for all the other things we're doing wrong, because at the end of the day, the Bais Rishon exilees were allowed to return after 70 years. It seems that God considered that they'd expiated their guilt, whereas now, after 170 years, or today for us, 2,000 years, it seems that we haven't expiated the guilt because we don't have Bais Shlishi. So that's this particular argument, which is again, you can argue everything both ways. Do you look at the results? Do you look at the effort you put in, etc.? And both of them are true perspectives. Very often, we look at an agadic discussion or a machlokas in the Gemara, and we say, who's right and who's wrong? The fact we're bringing two perspectives shows there are two perspectives to be brought in. Do we know why we haven't had a third Beis Hamikdash? Maybe we don't. We just don't know, because it's true to say there has been a huge amount of Mesiras Nefesh over the last 2,000 years. But other things haven't worked, and we don't know what God's plans are. But this is the fundamental discussion here in the Sechet Yuma, which is still fresh for us today. So we go on a few lines later. Says the Gemara carries on. Sha'alu is Rabbi Elazar. They asked Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar was actually a Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan. So we're talking about, within 30, 40 years of this original discussion between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, which generation was a greater generation? Was it those that were able to bring back, who survived the first Beis Hamikdash, eventually being able to come back, or with their grandchildren to Eretz Yisrael again? Or is it today because of all the efforts that we put in? So they asked the same question to Rabbi Elazar, and they asked him, Rishonim Gedolim or Acharonim Gedolim, as if he were to bring an end to this question. Maybe the debate raged for another 30 or 40 years. So they asked Rabbi Elazar, what do you think? Is it really the first generation, in other words, the Bais Rishon generation, who were greater, or is it the second generation? So Amar Lahem, and he gave the answer, not surprisingly, of his Rabbi Yochanan, and he said, Tenu einechem babira. Strange expression. Set your eyes on the palace, on the Beis Hamikdash. And what he was saying to them, he was being quite sarcastic, I think, when he said that. He was saying, to those who asked him the question, turn around, look out the window, and show me what the Beis Hamikdash looks like. And of course, they would have said to him, what do you mean? The Beis Hamikdash is a pile of rubble. There is no Beis Hamikdash. And that was the answer he was trying to give them. Tanei lechem babira. If you can see the Beis Hamikdash, then you'll have an answer to the question that, in fact, we're a great generation. If you can't see it, what does that mean? Whereas those who survived the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash were able, or at least their descendants were able, to see the second Beis Hamikdash. So he's in accord with this idea that Bais Sheni people, in some ways, haven't deserved the rebuilding. His generation also hasn't deserved the rebuilding. And Ikad Omri, the Gemara just brings you a slightly different girsa. In other words, it's just the expression that's changed, but it's the meaning's the same in what's coming. Amar Lahem, excuse me, that Rabbi Elazar said to them the following. He said, Eidechem bira, your testimony or your witnesses are the Beis Hamikdash. The Mefarshim try to understand how this is different. In other words, if you want a witness to come by and to tell you which generation is better, your witness is the Beis Hamikdash. If the Beis Hamikdash could talk, it would tell you. It's the same idea again. We have no Beis Hamikdash, which, at the end of the day proves that we haven't expiated our guilt, whereas they were able to expiate their guilt. That's the understanding here of the Gemara. Second, I wonder if I had some other notes, which I remember I had some other note I wanted to say. But let's go on, it may come back to me. Okay, the Gemara now is carrying on. We're not going to be on the discussion of which generation was better, but we're still generally in the Indian of Bais Sheni, of the second Beis Hamikdash, and whether in fact everything worked out so well during Bais Sheni, following the return from Bais Rishon. So essentially, we're moving to a few tangential topics, and we bring Reish Lakish again. And the Gemara tells us something in a story fashion. Reish Lakish, who lived in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish both lived in Eretz Yisrael. They were Amoraim, living about the year 200, 230, 250. And Havisochi b'Yardana, Reish Lakish was swimming in the River Jordan. It's quite difficult to swim in the River Jordan today, but at some point in time, the River Jordan might have been quite. Have I lost? What's always happening? I'll come in.
How can you come in?
I'll have to come out.
You're back now.
Am I back now? All right. Okay. Sorry. I don't know. Temporary gap. Reish Lakish was swimming in the Jordan, in the River Jordan. Am I still with you?
Yes.
Okay. Reish Lakish was swimming in the River Jordan, and I said the River Jordan was was probably wider at the time and quite a nice river to swim in, because there are many stories of the Gemara which suggest the River Jordan was actually fairly wide. Whereas nowadays it's a trickle, isn't it? Like a trickle over a stone or whatever. So, and he was swimming in the Jordan, and also Rabba Bar Bar Chana originally came from Bovel, although he then set up shop later on as another Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan in Eretz Yisrael, but he was a Babylonian, Rabba Bar Chana, another Amorah, and Yahav Lo Yadah. And he gave a hand to Reish Lakish to enable him to get out of the river. Right, so you see, Rabbi, he's had enough of the swim, and he wants to get out of the river. Reish Lakish is already getting a bit old, so Rabbi Bar Chana sees him there and gives him a hand and says, "Let me help you out of the river." Just before we go any very further, actually, which is it's fascinating, because Reish Lakish first appears almost in the Gemara swimming in a river. In the River Jordan. That's where he's first seen. He seems to spend his life in the River Jordan. Some people like bathing a little bit. And Reish Lakish was one of the greatest scholars, one of the greatest Talmidei Chachamim. And we find him here in his later life. This is a late life story. And originally, he's first found in the Gemara. He's introduced to us. The story is that Reish Lakish, and the Gemara says this, it's very strange, was originally a bandit. And he was also a gladiator. He actually made a living because of his great physical strength, when he used to fight lions and tigers and stuff like that. And he was, and also as a bandit, because he was a successful bandit as well, and made quite a name for himself. And he had a band of merry men around him, like Robin Hood. And he was originally swimming in the River Jordan. And it so happened that Rabbi Yochanan was passing at that time, and he saw Reish Lakish in the river, and they had a discussion. And Rabbi Yochanan said to Reish Lakish, this is part of the long story in the Gemara, he said that what are you doing wasting your time? He said, why don't you become a Torah scholar? If you become a Torah scholar, then I'll give you my sister as her hand in marriage. So he agrees. He wanted a career change. So he has a career change, and he marries Rabbi Yochanan's daughter, and he becomes the greatest scholar in Eretz Yisrael apart from Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are always arguing. Many years later, he becomes the sparring partner of Rabbi Yochanan, and essentially the only one who is considered to have been the equal of Rabbi Yochanan. So he starts off as a gladiator, and his first meeting is with Torah, or with a Torah scholar, is in the River Jordan. So over here, maybe he's trying to reenact those old days or whatever it is. So he goes back for a bathe in the River Jordan, and Rabbi Bar Chana comes along and wants to help him out. And Yahav Leyada, and he gave him his hand. Now listen to this. You'll all be shocked by what happens next. So Amalei, so Reish Lakish reacts to Rabbi Bar Chana, who is trying to assist him to come out, and he says, Eloha, abide by the hand of God, so to speak. It's an expression. It's often an expression used as an oath. I swear by God's name, so to speak. It's a little bit like that. Sonina lachu, oh dear. I hate you lot. He says this to Rabbi Bar Chana. He says, I hate you lot. He knows who Rabbi Bar Chana is. He's not referring to him personally. He's referring to him as a representative of the Babylonian population. And listen to what his complaint is. But he puts his complaint in the form of a devious posuk, which he then has to expound to explain his complaint. He doesn't say it straight out. This is his complaint. It follows. He says, Dichsiv, why do I hate you lot? Who's you lot? You Babylonians. because the Pasuk writes, and this is in Shir Hashirim, so in Shir Hashirim means something different. Im chomahi, if she is a wall, nivne oleha tiras kosef, we will build upon her a palace of silver. The imdeles he, and if she is a door, notsur oleha luach ores, we will place on her to secure her a beam of cedar. Well, does that explain why he hates Babylonians? There's not much over here about Babylon, but as usual, there is a reason. There's a reason behind all this. So he goes on to explain, which doesn't help very much. Im asisim atzmachem kachom. I'll explain this to you in greater detail after we've gone through these lines of Gemara. Im asisim atzmachem kachoma. If you will make yourself into a wall, a strong wall, or let me put this better, it's in the past tense. If you had made yourself into a wall, the Pasuk started, Im chomahi. If you, the Jewish people, had made yourself into a wall in which you tightly came together as a large unit, va'alisem kulachem b'mei Ezra, and you Babylonians had all come back to Eretz Yisrael during the time of Ezra, like a wall. In other words, every brick fitting into each other, then nimshaltem kakesef. You would be comparable to fine silver, she'ein rekev sholet bo, which no rot would be able to take hold of. But didn't happen. Achshav sha'alisen kadalosos, you decided to come up from Bovel like doors. It's not clear what it means like doors. It means like wooden doors, not like a wall made out of stone. Nimshaltem ka'eres, you are therefore only compared to cedar, shaharekev sholet bo, which is amenable to rotting. And that's because you didn't come up in the way you should have come up. Let me just share the screen with you and you'll look at the Pasuk. Oh, this keeps changing. I think it's this one. 1 second. I'm just going to the end. I'm sharing screen. I hope I'm sharing the screen. Okay, Shir Hashirim. This is the Pasuk I have over here. Im chomahi nivna aleha tiras kesef. So I've translated it here. If she be a wall, we will build upon it a silver battlement. Well, this is the Sepharia. I don't terribly means battlement. Okay, let's say. We will build upon it a silver battlement. Im delesi, if she be a door, we will panel it in cedar. So what he wants to say is this. He's saying that at the time of Ezra, what we know is that only something like 42,000 people had come up all together from Bovel to Eretz Yisrael. And they were not the creme de la creme either. The creme de la creme were left in Bovel. So a small number came up, and then they had all the problems in dealing with the Samaritans, and then they had to rebuild a small wooden temple, and Ezra had to make them get rid of their non-Jewish wives. All the tragedies that actually accompanied the return of the exiles. It wasn't an easy period, and there wasn't an ideal group of people that came up from Babel either. And they were a small minority of the whole lot. They were like a door coming up, a wooden door. Why is it called like a door? So he says over here, we'll see in a moment, that it's not even a hardy cedar wood. It's cedar wood with holes in it, worm-eaten. But you were a worm-eaten remnant that came out of Babel. And therefore, the fact is, if a worm-eaten segment come out of Babel into Eretz Yisrael, then the settlement in Eretz Yisrael is more likely to rot. If you'd have come up like a solid wood wall, a solid stone wall has no holes, it can't be worm-eaten, it's continuous, it's strong, it's heavy, then you would have been like today, like silver, which means the settlement in Eretz Yisrael would have been unassailable. So whose fault it is that we have a weak settlement in Eretz Yisrael? You Babylonians, because you came back half-heartedly and in small numbers. And so this is what Reish Lakish is saying. What an astonishing thing for Reish Lakish to say. So Reish Lakish obviously considered himself to be a long-standing Eretz Yisraeler, if you like, whose family came back when they were called. But Rabbi Bar Chana is just a here today man from Bovel. You know, his family have stayed in Bovel for hundreds of years. They never came back. Then he's the first person to come back, and he's back on a trip to learn Torah. So this is the accusation Reish Lakish makes to Rabbi Bar Chana. It seems that there was some harboring of grudge against Babylonians. We know that there was some competition between the Babylonian and Jerusalem academies at the time of the Talmudic period. But over here you can see a very striking and rather hurtful comment Reish Lakish launches against Rabbi Bar Chana because he was part, if you like, of a weak return. As a result of a weak return, you get a weak settlement. A weak settlement means essentially that the history of the Bias Sheni period was less glorious than it would have been if there had been a full return. The half-hearted return caused a great deal of this, is responsible in its knock-on effects for a lot of the subsequent suffering in Eretz Yisrael. This is what Reish Lakish is saying. What is interesting, because as I said, Reish Lakish himself is a Baal Tshuva. It's not as if he's got a glorious past. You know, he's been a bandit and a robber and everything. And yet, his accusation here is not you weren't from. You were frommer than me and your family were frommer than me. But you've only just come back from Bovel after all this time, whereas my family have been here all the time. You know, we're good Israelis. You may think you're a frommer coming from Borough Park, but we've been good Israelis many generations. This is the sort of idea behind this accusation. Anyway, the Gemara goes just to clarify a piece of detail which is totally unnecessary, but it's doing so. In the Pasuk said, the im deleski, if it's like a door, it's just thin wood, not so luach erez. We will coat it with a coating of silver, of cedar. Well, cedar is actually quite a strong wood. So actually the moshel, the parable here doesn't really fit very well. It's a very good wood, cedar wood. I mean, you know, it doesn't sound like it's a weak wood. So the Gemara says, my erez. What type of erez are we talking about? What type of cedar are we, the Jewish people, as a weakened force as a result of a small number only of the Babylonians returning? What is the comparison to cedar? So he says, the Gemara says, Ama'ula Sasmagor. No one really knows what it means. It's Sasmagar cedar. Rashi explains, etc. It seems to be that we're talking about a thin layer of cedar, which is also which is not hardy, and only seems to have the outer shell of the cedar of a tree. It's not a proper hard cedar, but a soft cedar, a malleable cedar, a crackable cedar, not one that you can rely on or lead on. And that's what we are today, as a result of only a small number of people coming up. The Gemara then asks, my Sasmagar, what is Sasmagar? Well, I mean, I just explained to you what Sasmagar was, but I didn't understand it anyway. Why are we saying Sasmagar? What is the nimshal to Sasmagar, this weak form of silver, of cedar? What is it telling us? Well, I said it's telling us that the people who come up, in a sense, are a weakened a reflection or projection of what they could have been if they'd come up in larger numbers. But the Gemara is going to give us another very interesting meaning to this weakened, this emphasis on weakness. And it's not just the weakness of the people, but it's the weakness of the connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what the Gemara is going to say. It is essentially a mashal for a weak connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Amar Rabbi Abba, it means to say, Baskol, Kiditanya. Let's just go on and see what this means, because it's meaningless if we don't learn this next brisa. It means Baskol. A Baskol is, simple translation, you heard the words, a Baskol comes from heaven. Baskol is a heavenly voice, an echo of a voice from heaven, something you may not even be sure you've heard correctly, which is some sort of divine message, which is transmitted from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but not with the strength of a prophecy. The Chazal say that there are three levels, if you like, from which you can come down from prophecy in two further levels. You have prophecy, nevuah. Then after that, you have Ruach HaKodesh. if you like, which is some sort of divine spirit of the person, the Holy Spirit, which a person is completely, he can't prophesy, but somehow he can get all his answers right or wrong, or he knows exactly what to do because Hashem is stirring within him, so to speak. It's not prophecy in its strongest form, it's a weaker form of prophecy. And the weakest form is bas kol. And a bas kol is a message that comes down and is usually hearable by more than one individual. If I'm the only one who gets a bas kol, it's not bas kol, it means I've got Ruach HaKodesh. But if a voice comes down and we all hear it somehow, in our brains, doesn't mean it's a booming voice which you can measure in decibels. We hear it in our brains, then that bas kol, that's a form of prophecy as well, which is a sort of a broadcast to mankind or to a group of people. That's what a bas kol is. Kidatanya, as the Brisa says, Mishemesu Neviim Hoacharenim, after the last prophets passed away, Chagi, Zechariah, Umalachi, the Brisa says, they were the last three Nevi'im, and they were Nevi'im already during Bais, the beginning of the resettlement in Eretz Yisrael, Bais Sheni, only for a short period. After they died, Nistalkar Ruach HaKodesh in Yisrael. This Ruach HaKodesh left. The Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh was the end of the era of Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. Va'adayin hayu mishtamshin bevas kol. The only thing that was left was a weak, soft remnant of Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh, and that was the bas kol. And this Sas Nagar, this sort of weakened level of cedar that we compare ourselves to, it's not that we don't have anything at all. We have this weak cedar. It's better than nothing. What's this weak cedar? It's the bas kol. That's all we're left with now, because if the return at the time of Ezra had been greater, we might still have Nevi'im, in other words, and Ruach HaKodesh. But because Rabbi Bar Chona's family and all sort of other people didn't come back and left only 42,000 impoverished people to come down with Ezra and Nehemiah, etc., to Eretz Yisrael, the only thing that we merit with today is bas kol. And there's a question, how long does bas kol last as well? Is there still a bas kol today? Do you hear bas kol? I mean, has the bas kol carried on indefinitely? So let me just say a few words here about bas kol. There are many Gemara stories that involve the bas kol. I mean, we have a bas kol actually deciding halacha. The Gemara says that so many years Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel used to argue, and then a bas kol came down from Shemaim and said that halacha is Beis Hillel. So who was this bas kol? Yeah, it was some sort of message from heaven that the Chazal, the sages, received. It may not have come down to the ordinary man working in the field, but it came down somehow, and they all received this message somehow that the halacha is Beis Hillel. There are other cases, actually very interesting, where Rabbi Eliezer says in this famous dispute on the Tanor Shlachnai, where he says, Lo b'shamayim hi, I'm not going to accept heaven ruling like these people rather than me, because nowadays halacha is in the hands of man. And he says, Ein meshkichen b'bas kol. I don't pay any attention to bas kol. I don't care whether a heavenly voice comes down and says whatever it says. The bas kol doesn't have any authority and regime anymore in the world today. So even if we were to hear a bas kol, it's an unusual statement. Don't listen to bas kol. There are various Gemaras that do talk about whether a bas kol should be taken seriously or not. Maybe I'm imagining this bas kol. Maybe we've all gone into mass hysteria and imagined a bas kol. So we have this idea that halacha does talk about bas kol, and that the bas kol should, in a sense, be influential and decisive. But we've seen in many cases in the Talmud that it's not accepted, that the bas kol is not accepted, even if it's genuine. According to Rabbi Eliezer says it's a genuine bas kol that's come from heaven, but I think heaven has forgotten that Lo b'shamayim hi, that when Torah Sheba'al Peh was given to the sages, that it's the sages who decide. And heaven should step back. It's been in charge long enough. That was Rabbi Eliezer. It's an extraordinary statement against the bas kol. So the bas kol is there. There are other types of bas kol which I find interesting as well. There's another version of the bas kol, which is more in terms of a flash inspiration that people get. There are a few Agadas. There's a famous Agada, for example, that says that every day a Bashkol comes out from heaven and proclaims, Oy li me'el bona shel Torah. Woe is to me, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, woe is to me, the disgrace of Torah. The Torah hasn't been learnt enough. And in other words, this voice coming down from heaven, complaining, and it comes down every day, and it even comes down to today. That Bashkol comes down and proclaims the affront that the Torah feels, or Hashem feels, for the way in which his Torah has been abandoned. And so that's not the same sort of Baskol that we're talking about, which is halachas like Beis Hillel. This is some sort of wavy stuff that comes down that everyone should be hearing. The vibes of this Baskol, that Torah has been abandoned, are in the air. We should be hearing it. That Baskol is an echo that should be coming down, and it should be playing about in our brains. So the Hasidish, there's a very well-known Hasidish stories about these Baskols. So in the Sivas Shalom, he quotes I think it's the Madim Mezerich who asked this famous question. He says, I don't understand these Gemaras that say there's a Baskol every day that says X, Y, or Z. I mourn the fact that Torah isn't being learnt. If there is such a Baskol, says the Madim Mezerich, why don't I hear it as well? And if I can't hear the Baskol, what's the point of it coming down? What's the point of there being a Baskol if nobody can hear it? Maybe there is a Baskol up there, but it's at such a low volume I can't hear it. Well, what's the point of a Baskol like that? I'm straining my ears to hear it, says the Maggid Mezerich, and I don't hear it. So he complains. So you know what? He gives an answer. The answer to that question is, why don't we hear this Baskol, this ever-present voice that resounds around the cosmos, telling us we're doing various things wrong, what you're doing, repair your ways. The reason is that we do hear it. He says that every time we have a voice of conscience that speaks in our head, and it's there for a moment, that was the Baskol. Don't say you haven't had a Baskol. It's like the case of a person who prays for God to save them during a flood, and he's on the roof of the house, and helicopters try and offer him a rope in order to escape. And he says, no. He says, God will save me. So he sends the helicopters away. We hear this Baskol, but we send the Baskol away. Whatever message that we're receiving, which we are receiving, it could be a conscience, a voice of conscience on anything, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. We take it as if it was just a voice playing on our heads. It's not a voice playing on our head. It's generated from above. And if we were to pay heedance to it, then we would improve ourselves. That's the way the Hasidic interpretation of the Baskol is. A beautiful idea. That this Baskol is an ever-present conscience that we have, which we avoid very often. And sometimes we don't realize is coming from a higher level. Okay, that's the Baskol, and the weakened transmission of the Nevuah, which Reish Lakish said is all because we didn't come back to Eretz Yisrael in big enough numbers. Okay, now the Gemara is going to ask. Actually, I'm going to stop over here because I think the next piece will take me a bit longer to explain, and we've got through this essential bit. So I will stop my share over here. Anyone who wishes to unmute, but certainly just quit recording.